I never thought the sound of my dog barking would trigger an all-out neighborhood war, but then again, I didn't expect to live next to people who measured freedom in decibels. When I first moved into Maplewood Ridge, it seemed like the perfect little town. Quiet streets, fresh air, neighbors who waved but didn't pry. I had just left behind a noisy city job, a boxed-in apartment, and the kind of stress that sticks to your ribs. I was ready for a slower life. Early mornings, black coffee, and my golden retriever, Duke, running through the grass with the kind of joy only dogs and toddlers know. The house was a small one-story place, but it had a fenced yard, a garden with struggling tomato vines, and just enough space to breathe. Duke took to it like it was built for him. He would spend hours lying on the porch, watching the wind shift the branches, barking now and then at squirrels, birds, or shadows he deemed suspicious. It was harmless, or so I thought. The first letter came on a Tuesday, folded tight in a plastic bag, and taped to my door like a warning label. Barking violation, Section 4.2.1 of Maplewood HOA Code, continuous canine disturbance. I read it twice, then looked at Duke, who was busy chewing a stick, and looked back at me like he had no idea he'd just become a criminal. I laughed, tossed the letter in the trash, and forgot about it. 2 days later, there was another, this time printed in red ink. Second notice. Along with it, a detailed report, timestamps, decibel levels, even a grainy photo of Duke mid-bark. I didn't even know our HOA had the budget for surveillance, let alone dog paparazzi. I figured it was just some overzealous board member with too much time. I walked over to the community office the next morning, planning to clear things up with a quick chat. What I found was more than a chat. It was a full-on tribunal. A long table, 5 people in pastel sweaters and name tags. The woman in the center, a tall blonde with stiff hair and a colder stare, introduced herself as Donna Briggs, HOA president. She spoke slowly, like every word was part of a legal deposition. They had received complaints, multiple ones, she said, barking, loud and frequent, a disruption to the peace. She used words like community harmony and enforcement protocol. I explained that Duke was just doing what dogs do. He barked, but never at night, and never for more than a few seconds. They weren't interested. They handed me a warning fine and told me further disturbances could result in daily penalties or even legal action. I walked out stunned, not angry yet, just confused. The anger came a week later when a man in khakis and an HOA compliance officer vest showed up to measure my fence. Duke barked once. The man wrote something down and left. The next day, I got another notice, this time citing aggressive behavior. From a bark, from a golden retriever. I started noticing strange things. Little flags staked in my lawn marked noise zone. Flyers about pet responsibility tucked under my windshield wipers. A neighbor I'd chatted with just days before now crossed the street when I walked Duke. Someone even tossed a dog whistle onto my porch. That's when I knew this wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Duke wasn't the problem, they were. And I wasn't about to roll over. So I made a plan. I didn't fight back the way they expected. No angry posts in the community group. No arguments at the next board meeting. I stayed quiet. I played dumb. But inside, I was working. Late into the night, I read their bylaws line by line. I started recording Duke's barking patterns, logging timestamps, and comparing them to neighborhood noise levels. I bought sound equipment. I built a case. And while I did, I started training Duke. Duke was already smart, smarter than most people I knew. With a little patience, a lot of treats, and a voice button board I'd seen online, I started teaching him something special. I labeled one button HOA and repeated the word every time we got a new complaint. It didn't take long before Duke would hit the button on his own, especially when he saw a vest, a clipboard, or the color beige. 3 weeks in, he was using it on command. Bark, pause, press the button. Bot, pause, hua. I couldn't help but laugh the first time he did it in front of a visiting inspector. The man's face tightened, then reddened. Then he walked off in silence. The next day, I got another fine. But this time, I pinned it to the wall like a trophy. They were watching, but so was I. The notices kept coming, each more absurd than the last. One claimed Duke's vocalizations constituted verbal harassment. Another cited intentional disruption of community standards. I even got a warning about mockery of official procedures, which I didn't know was an actual thing. But then again, this was the Maplewood HOA, where barking could be a felony and pastel polos were the uniform of power. I kept recording. Every notice, every encounter. I mapped out the times and routes of the so-called inspectors. I tracked on a schedule. I noticed she always left at 3 p.m., right after her daily compliance sweep. I set up cameras, not just in my yard, but along the perimeter, and I started noticing more than I expected. One evening, I caught something strange, Donna herself standing across the street, holding what looked like a remote. A second later, Duke's ears perked, and he barked. Then again, I checked the footage. She was pointing the remote at something in the bushes near my fence. I zoomed in. A small speaker, camouflaged, clicking to life just before Duke reacted. They were provoking him. That was the last straw. I took down the speaker, documented everything, and built a file. But I didn't send it anywhere. Not yet. I wanted to make sure they understood what real disruption looked like. So the next morning, when the compliance officer came back, clipboard in hand, Duke met him at the gate. He barked once, then walked to the board, pressed the button. HOA. The man blinked. Duke barked again. HOA. Another bark. Another HOA. The officer turned and walked away without a word. And that's when I knew I hadn't just trained Duke. I trained my warning shot. The next few days were oddly calm. No new letters, no surprise inspections, no lawn flags or laminated warnings taped to my door. It was the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the pause in a storm just before the lightning strikes. I didn't trust it. Duke seemed to sense it too. He'd sit by the window longer than usual, watching the street like he was waiting for something. I noticed cars slow down when they passed my house, phones lifted behind tinted windows. At night, I'd hear faint clicks and buzzes near the fence line. Cameras, maybe motion sensors, but I couldn't find anything conclusive. One night, around 3 a.m., Duke woke me up with a low growl. When I checked the front yard, I found 3 small plastic cones staked in the grass. Each had a tiny sticker on it that read, Noise Violation Observation Zone. They didn't even try to be subtle anymore. This wasn't enforcement. This was a campaign. By the weekend, I realized the silence wasn't peace. It was planning, and their plan revealed itself when the HOA mailed me a certified letter titled Formal Behavioral Review Request. Inside was a 3-page evaluation of Duke's temperament, a diagram of his barking frequency overlaid on a digital map of the neighborhood, and a request that he undergo a noise compliance assessment by an HOA-approved behavioral specialist. The last line was the punch. Failure to comply may result in mandatory removal proceedings. They were threatening to take Duke. That's when everything in me snapped into clarity. This wasn't about noise. It never was. It was about control. The HOA didn't care about barking. They cared about obedience. And I wasn't giving it to them. That night, I stayed up reviewing every file I had. Videos, photos, timestamps, audio logs. I compiled it all into a digital folder labeled Operation Collarbone. I don't know why I picked the name. Probably because they thought they had me by the neck. But I was going to show them who really had the leash. I didn't go to the HOA. I went to the neighbors. I knocked on doors, showed them clips of Duke responding to planted noises. I played audio of Donna's voice speaking into hidden speakers. Most were shocked. Some were quiet. A few closed the door without a word. But 5 families listened. 2 of them had received similar warning letters. One had been fined for a rooster he didn't even own. Another had a garden citation for unauthorized vertical growth. One woman, Mrs. Jensen, had a video of a man digging near her fence. When she confronted him, he claimed to be part of a neighborhood soil health check, which no one had ever heard of. Within a week, I had my own coalition. We met quietly in garages, swapped stories, compared documents. We called ourselves the Unbarked. Duke became our mascot. I gave them copies of the HOA bylaws, showed them how vague the language was, how terms like excessive and non-compliant were used like clubs to beat down anyone who questioned authority. It wasn't just about animals. It was about behavior. They wanted us predictable, polite, quiet. Anything else became a problem. But we weren't problems. We were homeowners, taxpayers, dog lovers, garden planters, music players. And we were done being targets. We launched our first move on a Saturday morning. Everyone in the unbark simultaneously submitted a request for HOA policy clarification, a procedural form buried on page 73 of the handbook. It required the board to respond within 72 hours to every request. We submitted 27. Then we filed a collective request for an audit of HOA surveillance expenditures. By policy, they were required to make their spending public. The moment we requested the financials, things shifted. The HOA stopped smiling. Donna stopped waving. And the very next day, my mailbox was broken in half. Not knocked over, snapped clean through like someone used a saw. The metal box was crushed inward, and on the ground beside it was a small card that read, "Reminder, compliance begins at home." It didn't have a name, but I didn't need one. I replaced the mailbox with a steel one and added a motion sensor camera above it. It was worn now, and I wasn't going in blind. Meanwhile, Duke's training continued. He was responding to new buttons now: noise, quiet, go, and most importantly, camera. I'd point to a bush or pole and say, "Camera," and he'd bark once and press the button. He was right 9 times out of 10. It was almost eerie, like he could smell surveillance. The neighbors loved it. Kids came by to watch him perform, and I made sure to smile for every smartphone that recorded us. I wanted people to see it because they needed to understand that this was never about a dog. This was about fear, and we were refusing to be afraid. Then came the third letter. Bold red border, thicker envelope, urgent wording. Emergency board hearing, property 11B, allegation, coordinated disruption and behavioral sabotage. It was scheduled for Wednesday evening. I was to present myself alone, with Duke muzzled, or risk forced mediation. They were calling me out, but they made a mistake. They gave me a date, a place, a time, and they assumed I'd show up like everyone else, apologetic, nervous, compliant. But I was bringing the storm with me. That afternoon, I uploaded a trailer. A 30-second video compilation of surveillance footage, whistle triggers, fake violations, and neighborhood confessions, all ending with Duke pressing the HOA button and barking into the camera. I titled it, "What's Really Going On in Maplewood Ridge?" By the time I stepped into the community center that evening, the video had 92,000 views. And a local reporter had already left a voicemail. That'd be why the time I arrived at the community center, the tension was thick enough to cut with a dull garden spade. The room was arranged like a courtroom, though no judge sat at the front. Just Donna Briggs and the other board members, all wearing matching navy jackets with gold embroidered letters that read, "Maplewood Compliance Authority." They didn't look up as I walked in, didn't acknowledge Duke at my side, his head held high and unmuzzled. A camera crew stood in the back, barely noticeable to anyone not looking, but I had invited them myself. A small local channel, hungry for a headline. I didn't say anything as I handed over the USB with the footage. I just sat, let them stew, and waited as they loaded it onto their projector. For a moment, there was confusion, whispers, flickers of concern. Then the screen lit up, and everything changed. It began with the audio logs, faint speaker clicks, distorted chirps, and then Duke barking in perfect sync. The video zoomed in on the fake cones, the concealed devices, the remote in Donna's hand. Then came the shots of other properties, roaming inspectors, fabricated notices, footage of one man laughing as he stapled a violation letter onto someone's garage door in the middle of the night. The audience in the room shifted uncomfortably, the air turning from stiff authority to tight embarrassment. Then came the clip of Duke pressing the HOA button, the highlight of it all, followed by a rapid collage of neighbors' testimonies, the fines, the threats, the psychological games. The final frame read, "What else are they hiding?" When the lights flickered back on, Donna stood frozen. Her face flushed a pink too deep for her skin tone. But she wasn't the type to cave. She cleared her throat, accused me of manufacturing evidence, manipulating videos, orchestrating a smear campaign against the very institution keeping Maplewood safe. She asked for the video to be dismissed, claimed it was a digital prank designed to discredit lawful oversight. but her voice cracked just slightly on the word lawful, and that crack was all it took. People began to murmur. One man stood up and asked why his backyard had been flagged for suspicious irrigation patterns. Another waved a letter that cited non-compliant wind chime acoustics. The mood turned. Donna knew it, and she did what all tyrants do when cornered. She doubled down. That night, the HOA issued a district-wide Order of Emergency Behavioral Caution, a fancy term that basically told the neighborhood I was a risk to community order and to avoid me entirely. Flyers went out, not just to mailboxes but tacked to trees, stapled to telephone poles, and slid under windshield wipers. Duke was labeled a pattern disruptor. I was given the designation of Tier 3 behavioral hazard. The next morning, I found someone had spray-painted a symbol on my driveway, an odd triangle within a circle, unfamiliar but deliberate. Beneath it, the words Phase 2 initiated. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew it wasn't random. That's when the drones began. Small ones at first, buzzing over the roof in the early morning, hovering just long enough to make their presence known. They came in pairs, then threes, flying low, weaving through the tree line. I caught one on camera trailing a local teenager riding his bike. Another hovered outside my window for 23 minutes, just floating. I called Langley County Sheriff's Department. They sent a deputy, but he shrugged it off, said it was probably hobbyists or a drone enthusiast group. I knew better. These weren't toys. These were tools, and someone was funding them. It wasn't long before we traced the trail. One of the neighbors I'd connected with worked in public records and found something odd. A new nonprofit registered just 2 months prior named Community Engagement for Sustainable Environments, or CESE. Its director, Donna Briggs. The listed objectives were vague, filled with phrases like civic enhancement, soundscape regulation, and behavioral noise mitigation. They had received a sizable grant from a regional development firm, $230,000 for pilot program implementation. We dug deeper and found other connections. CESE was backed by a shell corporation tied to a private equity group known for buying up property at depressed prices. It clicked. This wasn't just about barking. It was about lowering property values, pushing people out, and buying land cheap. Control wasn't the goal. It was the method. I held a town hall of my own. Not official. Not advertised. Just word of mouth, a sign posted on my fence. Truth meeting tonight. Over 60 people showed up. Some stood. Some sat on folding chairs. Duke stood at the front with me, the symbol of everything they had tried to silence. I laid out the evidence, timelines, documents, financial trails. I showed them what CESE really was, how their own HOA fees were funneled into this project, how their properties were being flagged, not for noise, but for transition evaluation, a phrase found buried in an internal memo from the nonprofit's funding proposal. That night, something changed in Maplewood Ridge. Fear turned to fury. Doubt turned to direction. But it didn't stop the next strike. Just 48 hours later, I woke up to sirens and flashing lights. For security vehicles with blacked-out windows lined the street. A man in a reflective vest handed me a letter as Duke barked behind me. Immediate property evaluation order, it said. They claimed I had violated environmental ordinances, created unsafe conditions, and was now subject to mandatory external review. They weren't police. They weren't code enforcement. They were CESE agents with fake badges and walkie-talkies scanning my yard, photographing Duke, trying to force entry. I told them nothing, just stood my ground until they left. But it was clear they had escalated. That evening, I checked the footage and saw it, Donna again, standing behind the fence line, whispering into a radio, gesturing to a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He wore all black, no ID, no gear, just a cold stillness. He never spoke, just watched. My cameras caught him 4 more times that week, always at a distance, always in silence. They were sending a new message now. Compliance wasn't enough. I had become a variable, an anomaly they couldn't control. I knew the final move was coming. The pieces were too neatly arranged, the silence too deliberate, and the watchers too bold to pretend anymore. My name had gone from homeowner to hazard in their system, and Duke wasn't just a dog to them anymore. He was evidence, a symbol of defiance, a disruption they couldn't predict. I reinforced the fences, backed up the footage, wired the perimeter with motion sensors, and set Duke's training board to voice record mode. He learned new phrases now, ones I hadn't planned, mimicking sounds he heard, phrases like inspection team and noise audit. It wasn't a trick. It was a warning. I changed the passwords to every device I owned and boxed up the physical files into a steel case I buried behind the barn, just in case someone decided to remove the truth physically. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was bracing for erasure. The last escalation came at 2:17 a.m., 3 nights after the security vehicles first appeared. My cameras caught a blackout. Every feed cut simultaneously. A pulse, like a signal jammer. When the backup batteries kicked in, the footage came back. 3 figures already inside the property line, not on foot but silent scooters, riding low to the ground. They wore black from head to toe, no markings, no lights. Each one moved with surgical precision. 2 made for the barn, 1 toward the side entrance of my house. Duke was already alert, tail stiff, body angled, a growl climbing in his chest. I whispered one word, record, and he slammed the button with his paw. Every camera synced to his command. I didn't move from a shadow of the hallway. I watched through the monitors. The man by the barn planted a device. The screen showed it blinking, red, then blue, then off. The other 2 split up. 1 knelt by the generator. The 3rd approached the porch. I pressed the failsafe buried under the stair panel. Lights exploded across the field like a stadium unveiling a secret. The agents scattered, but I'd spent weeks designing that chaos. The perimeter sirens triggered, the rotating strobe pattern disoriented their senses, and Duke's board lit up, his paw pressing again and again. HOA, HOA, alert noise. They weren't expecting the resistance. One dropped to his knees, clutching his head as directional sirens pierced the silence in oscillating frequencies. Another tried to run, but tripped over a wire I'd strung knee-high through the garden path. The one at the barn didn't even flinch, just stared at the camera like he wanted to be seen. I watched him remove his mask and toss it into the bushes, revealing a face too polished, too clean. He pointed at the lens and made a motion across his neck. Not a threat, a gesture of finality. He pressed a button on his wristband and vanished into the darkness like he had never been there. By the time the sheriff arrived, all that remained were boot prints and a blinking transmitter buried in the soil. Langston took one look at the footage and called the state. This wasn't HOA enforcement. This wasn't even cease anymore. It was something else entirely. That morning, I opened the last encrypted file from the backup drive I'd recovered 2 weeks prior. It was titled Final Protocol, Maplewood Contingency Node. Inside, a full profile, on me, on Duke, on the property's layout, even behavioral predictions. The header read, Behavioral Recalibration Candidate, Unsuccessful. Escalation required. Beneath that, a list of keywords flagged during surveillance. Resistance, mobilize, phase out, animal proxy disruption. The last entry was a memo signed by someone named A. Delcroft, an advisor I vaguely remembered from an old consultancy project years ago, someone tied to behavioral architecture within community redevelopment grants. The document was clear. What started as a barking complaint had morphed into a live case study in rural obedience management. I wasn't the target. I was the prototype. And Duke, unintentionally, had become the test subject for psychological animal-assisted conditioning. They weren't just trying to break me. They were testing how dogs could be used to manipulate household compliance indirectly. I printed everything and handed it to the journalist who had been covering my story since the town hall. She took it without asking questions, her face pale with the weight of it. Within days, the story was everywhere. Not just about Maplewood, but about the system that had grown quietly behind the facade of neighborhood safety. Cease was exposed, its connections to private equity firms and government contracts laid bare. Donna Briggs was arrested, not just for fraud, but for unauthorized data collection and conspiracy to interfere with civil property rights. Her house was searched, and inside, officials found the same binders and maps I had seen weeks before. only now labeled with other neighborhoods, other dog names, other color-coded resistance charts. The program hadn't started with me, and it wasn't meant to end with me either. But something did end that week. The signs came down. The patrols stopped. The flyers disappeared. People started talking again. One by one, neighbors came to the gate, some in shame, some in solidarity. Apologies were whispered. Support was offered. A few brought treats for Duke, who now spent most of his time sitting on the porch like a veteran who'd seen too much. The camera stayed up. The training board remained. I didn't trust peace anymore, not when it could be manufactured, but I did trust awareness. And now, everyone was awake. The final piece came in the form of a letter. No return address. Just one page, typed in courier font. It read, "Congratulations. The prototype held. Proceeding to Phase 5 has been suspended pending further review. No further engagement will be attempted. You have been reclassified. Unrecoverable. Watch listed. Good luck." I didn't know who sent it. Maybe someone from the inside who disagreed with how far things had gone. Maybe it was meant as a warning or a farewell. Either way, it meant one thing. I had won, but only because I hadn't played by their rules. Now Duke barks only when he wants to, not on command, not in fear. And when he does, sometimes it sounds a little like he's saying HOA. I don't correct him. I let it echo across the yard like a battle cry carved in bark. The HOA sign at the front of the neighborhood now bears a new inscription, added by someone anonymously. "You can't leash freedom." And below it, someone spray-painted a paw print with 3 letters underneath. HOA. The neighborhood changed. I changed. But most of all, Duke changed the story. What began as a complaint ended as a call to resist. Not just for dogs, not just for homeowners, but for anyone who's ever been told to be quiet when what they needed was to be heard.